Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and today we're going to tackle the crucial difference between multilingual, polyglot, and hyperpolyglot. Stay tuned. Let's begin with the difference between multilingual on the one hand and polyglot on the other. Now, I touched upon this distinction in my conversation with famous polyglot Richard Simcox. From an etymological perspective, multilingual and polyglot mean exactly the same. Multilingual is a Latin-based word which means multi, a lot, and lingual, language, whereas polyglot is a Greek-based word which means exactly the same, poly, many, and glot, language, many languages. However, in practice, these two words are used differently. When we say someone is multilingual, we mean that that person happens to speak many languages. Now, the accent here, the key is happens to. This means that that person hasn't made a conscious effort, deliberate effort to learn those languages. It just happens to be the case that as a result of that person's upbringing and education, that person speaks many languages. For instance, imagine someone who was raised by a father who spoke in French and a mother who spoke in Dutch, and at school that person learned English and was taught in German. As a result, said person speaks 4 different languages. However, we cannot say that there was a deliberate effort on the account of that specific person to learn those 4 languages. Compare this to somebody who is raised in a monolingual household and educated in the same language at school. However, that person, through a deliberate effort, goes to a course of German, takes a French class on italki, looks for a Portuguese language partner, and as a result, he or she learns 3-4 languages. That is no longer a multilingual person, that is a polyglot. So there is a personal investment of some sort. Speaking many languages is part and parcel of that person's identity. It's not something that just happens to that person. It's something that that person is personally invested in. So that is the difference between a multilingual person and a polyglot. Now, what is the difference between a polyglot and a hyperpolyglot? Now, the term hyperpolyglot is relatively recent. It was coined a few years ago by a British linguist by the name of Richard Hudson. And although this term is recent, the phenomenon that it refers to is, of course, more ancient. Now, the popularization of the term hyperpolyglot, as pointed out by Dr. Shohani in his working paper, Who is a Hyperpolyglot, goes back to Hudson himself and Erard. Both authors sought to differentiate between speakers of languages at a high level versus speakers of languages at an extraordinary level. Now, there are, of course, different thresholds by which to judge who is a hyperpolyglot and who is simply a polyglot. The cutoff for hyperpolyglots is by no means a fixed or predetermined threshold, and varying numbers are found. Now, Hudson himself seemed to suggest that more than 12 languages fluency will make someone a hyperpolyglot. In contradistinction, the International Association of Hyperpolyglots, so-called HYPEA, sets the bar at 6 languages, and in his work, Shohan, the president of that association, explains that 6 is already a number that implies a deliberate effort on the part of the learner. It is rarely by accident that somebody speaks at least 6 languages. In addition to this, it's not as high as 12 or 20, which will make the group of hyperpolyglots a very reduced one. Now, my personal opinion is that a hyperpolyglot is somebody who speaks 10 or more languages. But whatever the number we choose, the point is that the distinction between polyglot on the one hand and hyperpolyglot on the other is functional, is justified to the extent to which it allows us to distinguish between very good learners and extraordinary learners. This, however, does not mean fetishizing hyperpolyglots. Many works have appeared which herald the magical gift of hyperpolyglots for language acquisition. Amari, for instance, calls them prodigious polyglot savants. In a recent article, Thurman posits that hyperpolyglots have preternatural abilities. However, there are two important points here, which Johan also makes in his article. Point number one is that hyperpolyglossia is better understood as a skill that is honed over time than as a gift. Point number two is that there are far more hyperpolyglots than one might realize. And here I like to point out to two quotes by Erard. The first one is, "These, meaning hyperpolyglots, aren't geniuses, but they do possess unusual neurological resources. They have a penchant for conspicuous consumption of time and brain power that appears to be linked to the brain they possess." And the second quote, which is a nice summary of what a hyperpolyglot is, in my opinion, is, "They are not born, they are not made, but they are born to be made." Meaning there are certain genetic predispositions that allow for somebody to speak many languages, but on top of that, there is a very deliberate, conscious effort that has to take place on a consistent basis for that multilingual person to turn into a polyglot, and for that polyglot to eventually reach hyperpolyglossia. Erard further distinguishes between bizglots, broglots, and fauxglots. Now, a bizglot is someone who uses his or her hyperpolyglossia to do business with that, to run a company, to derive a profit. A broglot, in contrast, is somebody who is just enthusiastic about languages, a linguophile that encourages other people to learn as many languages as possible without necessarily deriving any monetary profit. Finally, fauxglots are people who pretend to be either polyglots or hyperpolyglots, but are actually not. These are the kind of people who claim to speak many languages but don't show any receipts, or when they do show receipts, these are basically pre-scripted videos where they have memorized the sentences they need to say in order to pose as fluent in that language without having the fluency to back that up in real life. Now, that being said, there are serious objections to the idea of hyperpolyglossia. My main criticism is that the idea of hyperpolyglossia is a product of the neoliberal and colonial rationality. From the viewpoint of critical linguistics, for instance, treating languages as separate, discrete, autonomous, countable entities verges on the absurd, but at the same time, it is by no means accidental. As shown by an extensive bibliography anchored in concepts such as reconstituting languages, named languages, and translanguaging, this fallacy is deeply rooted in the linguistic ideologies that are concomitant to neoliberalism and colonialism. In reality, the question of what counts as a language, of course, is very tricky. And since the concepts of polyglot and hyperpolyglot rely on the possibility of counting languages, then it follows that both notions are based on flaky assumptions. Consider, for instance, the issue of scales of fluency. What counts as speaking a language? Do I speak a language if I have a B1 level or a B2 level? Do I need a C1 level? At what point do you draw the line between speaking a language and not speaking a language. It is always subject to the discretion of whomever feels that has enough expertise to judge on somebody's level in a given language. Second, the distinction between language and dialect is to some extent arbitrary. Now, in theory, the difference between a language and a dialect is based on two linguistic criteria, which are as follows: mutual intelligibility and lexical similarity, which means if I can understand you and you can understand me, and our languages have many words in common, probably we are talking about a language and a dialect as opposed to two different languages. However, each of these, the mutual intelligibility criterion and the lexical similarity criterion, are in turn overdetermined by socio-political factors. So, for instance, if you speak Serbian, do you also speak Croatian and Bosnian? So do you speak one language or do you speak three in exactly the same linguistic situation? Another example, if you speak Spanish and Judeo-Spanish like I do you speak a language, Spanish, and a dialect, Judeo-Spanish, or do you speak two different languages? Yet another instance, if your first language is Spanish and you speak Portuguese, Italian, and French, are you more of a polyglot than someone whose first language is also Spanish, but has learned Mandarin and Arabic? Again, four languages in the first case, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and French, all from the same family, versus Spanish, Mandarin, and Arabic, three languages, but from different families. So this example shows that numbers alone can only tell us so much about who we are as polyglots or hyperpolyglots. It's not always about the number. Thus, as Richard Simcott has recently stated, judging who speaks, inquiring about how many languages you speak, is a false standard, and one that gets raised, ironically, mostly by monoglots, Americans in particular. So let's just say that I have studied more than 50 and I use about half of them. That's how he answers the question, how many languages do you speak? So if the term hyperpolyglot has so many difficulties and shortcomings, why do I use it in my YouTube channel and my company, the Hyperpolyglot Activist? Well, here I would like to distinguish between a strategic use and a vocational use. Now, when you use a term strategically, it means that you are aware of its shortcomings and nonetheless you choose to use it in a given context because you want to draw the benefits that are concomitant to the use of that term. So when I use hyperpolyglot, I know that this term is going to inspire people to want to learn more languages, to want to learn about my story, learning languages, etc. So I draw upon that potential without necessarily believing that the term hyperpolyglot is perfect and unproblematic. A vocational use, on the other hand, happens when you use a term and you believe 100% in that term. You're not aware of the fact that that term has many shortcomings and is problematic in many aspects. In other words, you don't really have a critical understanding of what that term means. In contrast, I am perfectly aware of the fact that the term hyperpolyglot cannot be understood in absence of an entire industry and an army, none of which I second. I am not, as the weekend put it, blinded by the lights. And this is precisely why in my company, in my YouTube channel, I combine the terms hyperpolyglot with activist to stress the fact that, as I discuss in this short excerpt with Usman, learning languages is not an end in and on itself, but a means to better understand the world and to make a positive difference in it. It seems to me that there is a gap between polyglots whose skills are off the charts and are able to showcase their talents in many languages, and people who have awareness as to the functioning of language in our society and in politics. and it's hard to find individuals that are able to reconcile both, but it's necessary. And so I do see as my main mission that of recasting linguistics as public scholarship, and that element of awareness is necessary for that to come into fruition.
Neoliberalism has made us try to transform language into capital, instruments for publicizing ourselves. But if you look at it from a neoliberal lens itself, indigenous to neoliberal assumptions, we'll find that this industry itself is based on a very flaky assumption that you can have a unique barrier to entry to language. But as you know, and I know, there is no visa application to learn Mandarin. There is no passport to understand Serbian. And so when you see the proliferation, which is the Marxist critique of capital, that it will be an overproduction of things, you see an overproduction of polyglots on YouTube, indistinguishable from one another. Some get it lucky that they will promote themselves through a New York Times piece on them or this piece on them. But even then, if there is no substance to back the asset, which is to say, for example, your study of philosophy or something with instrumentalism in a deeper sense, then the asset itself becomes hollow and you become like a circus monkey. You dance in one direction, you dance in another direction, and there is nothing to it beyond that. What do you think?
Learning languages and being able to speak them with a certain degree of fluency, it's banal or trivial unless it helps us making a bigger, broader sense of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all from me. I hope the difference between multilingual, polyglot, and hyperpolyglot is now clear. And as always, thanks for watching.